Staten's writings are inscribed in a deconstructive philosophical tradition that finds perhaps in Jacques Derrida, I would not say an origin and certainly not a destination, for Staten's recent work goes well beyond deconstruction, but a starting point or coup d'envoi. Working at the juncture of continental philosophy, aesthetics, and literary criticism, his early work includes seminal books on deconstruction, such as Wittgenstein and Derrida, published in 1984, which is one of the earliest and, in my opinion, most informed account of Derrida that takes the trouble to inscribe deconstruction in the philosophical tradition from which Derrida thought emerges, especially phenomenology, while also offering an original comparison with Wittgenstein that goes beyond traditional analytic continental fences. I still remember Henry showing me a letter from Derrida praising the book at the beginning of my studies, which made quite an impression on me and set the bar rather high, as might say. His second book, Nietzsche's Voice, published in 1990, is the one I actually read first for obvious personal interests, and I still consider it one of the most illuminating books on Nietzsche to date. A detailed reading with and against Nietzsche of the libidinal and economy of his soul that transacts Nietzsche's entire corpus and is attentive to the rigor of Nietzsche's immanent philosophy of the body as to the language or style through which it is mediated. I always recommend it every time I get a chance to teach Nietzsche. Other books include Eros in Mourning, published in 1995, which traces the psychic dialectics or psychodialectics of the interplay between Eros and Thanatos in exemplary texts in Western thought, from Homo to Lacan, this being its ambitious subtitle. Over the past decade, Henry Staten developed a formalist method of analysis he calls Technic Theory, which he used to analyze Victorian novels, poetry, and art more generally in books like Spirit Becomes Matter, 2014, The Craft of Poetry with Derek Attridge, published in 2015, and most recently, Techne Theory, subtitled A New Language for Art, published in 2019, which does what the title says. That is, it provides a new way of thinking about art that does away with the myth of the original genius while also pushing against a notion of mimesis as representation. The title of this paper today is Techne versus Mimesis in Plato's Republic. Henry, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Nidesh. And thank you for inviting me to this meeting. It's been a long time of solitude. It's really nice to come out. My paper is relatively modest compared to what you just heard from Mikkel. It's I'm going to be reading the text of Book 10 fairly closely. To bring out things like what I was just saying to Mikkel about the distinction between the couch and the painting of the couch, which I'm going to argue is actually the center of Socrates' concern in this chapter. In Book 3 of the Republic, Socrates proposes to Glaucon that they ban imitative poetry from their imaginary city. And at the beginning of Book 10, he reaffirms this ban. He tells Glaucon they were right to exclude poetry because it degrades the soul of anyone who doesn't know what imitative poetry really is. Such knowledge, he says, is an antidote to the bad effects of poetry. However, instead of explaining what poetry really is, he starts on the question of imitation in general by proposing his famous allegory of the three couches, which you're all familiar with. The idea of a couch made by a god, which is fully real, 2 levels down, according to the Greek, right? And I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to say that the carpenter-made couch is 2 levels away from the full reality, because that's what Socrates calls it. We would say 1 level or 1 remove but he says two, and it has more bite that way. And then, of course, the painted couch, which has no reality at all. This allegory is simply a wrong step by Socrates, a digression from the main course of his argument against poetry. And it's unfortunate that it has historically overshadowed the subsequent development of Socrates' remarks. And it's this subsequent development that I want to trace. By the time Socrates leaves behind the analogy to painted mimesis, the analogy of poetry to painted mimesis, to focus once again on poetry itself, he seems to have told us what imitative poetry really is, a quote, imitation of an imitation in the old formulation, or imitation of a copy in a more accurate formulation. By the time he leaves, yeah, he seems to have told us what it is, but he hasn't. There are several problems with the three couches allegory. The God-made couch is fully real, Socrates says, but human-made artifacts like couches are less real than the idea twice removed from the king and the truth. But as various interpreters have noted, the super worldly Platonic ideas are completely irrelevant in this context. The Platonic ideas are nowhere else in Plato does he talk about ideas of things like artifacts. They're ideas of abstractions like the one, the good, the true, the beautiful. And so these metaphysically transcendent ideas of particular artifacts makes no sense at all. It's hard enough to make sense of the abstract ideas, but the ideas of artifacts, never again does Plato touch such a notion. So instead of giving it a sense, Socrates gradually drifts away from this conception after introducing it. And as he gets closer to his central target, Homer, he allows the God-made idea to fade completely away from his argument. This incoherence in the three couches schema and the drift of Socrates' discourse away from it suggests that the knowledge antidotal to tragic poetry cannot be that poetry is an imitation of a copy. The confusion in Socrates' reasoning here is rooted in a deep contradiction between the idealizing trend of the theory of ideas and the fundamentally ethical nature of Socrates' intellectual project. In the early and some of the middle Platonic dialogues, Socrates persistently tries to find a systematic form of ethical knowledge, and he looks to the various forms of ordinary techni as models of reliable, knowledge-grounded practice. This is something that Mikkel talked about, but I'm going to talk about it in a somewhat different way. This focus on Techne leads him to pragmatic conceptions of form that sort badly with the conceptions sponsored by the theory of ideas. This contradiction is what leads to the obscurities in Socrates' account of the antidote to mimesis. The forms or ideas exist apart from all worldly realities and are graspable only by the intellect. By profound contrast, the order and organization, the forms created by the techni, are ineluctably functional, definable only in relation to the material exigencies of the practical tasks of human existence. All the fundamental worldly techni, carpentry, farming, horsemanship, military strategy, politics, are concerned with objects that belong to the world perceived by the senses. And they exist, as Socrates says in Republic 1, in order to fulfill human needs. Socrates explains there that the techne of medicine, for example, has been discovered, quote, because our bodies are deficient rather than self-sufficient. And the same could be said of all the techni. The kind of knowledge they involve is tied to the needs of the body, thus as far removed as possible from the static perfection of the ideas. Unlike animals, which can survive using only their bodies and their instincts, human beings require tools and techniques optimally adapted to the performance of specific practical functions. We don't usually think about Plato in terms of this kind of thought, but it's right there. Book 1 of the Republic has no truck with the ideas. It's all about this kind of practical necessity. Socrates is conflicted about this. He speaks respectfully of Techne most of the time, but when the ideas pop up, he demeans it. Thus, in book 1, where he doesn't mention the ideas, he says that every Techne is, quote, perfect in itself. But in book 7, where he introduces the idea of the good, he says that the Techni are banausoi, menial or vulgar. Similarly, in the Allegory of the Three Couches, where he floats the notion of a God-made idea of couch, Socrates demeans the reality of the carpenter-made couch and of the techne of carpentry itself, along with that of the painter-made imitation and the techne of painting. He agrees with Glaucon that the painter doesn't make things that really exist, onta, and then adds that the carpenter too doesn't make that which is, hoesti, but only something resembling that which is. The carpenter-made couch is only twice removed from the idea, so it has more reality than the painter-made image. Nevertheless, Socrates says that the reality of the artisanal couch too, like that of the painted image, is dim or obscure. When he downgrades the reality of earthly things in this way, Socrates conveys the attitude that, as he says a few pages later, compared with the higher reality of the ideas, human affairs aren't worth taking very seriously. That's how he talks when the ideas pop up. This is 604b. And even though in the entire Republic he labors to design an earthly polity that could instantiate the virtue of justice, in book 7, after presenting his allegory of the cave with its mystical vision of the idea of the good, Socrates depreciates the earthly pursuit of justice in the law courts as contention over mere, quote, shadows of justice. Nevertheless, after his flights into the ideal, Socrates always comes back down to earth to grapple with the problems of ethics and of the enabling condition of ethics, the constitution of the polis, the central problem of the Republic. Even in Republic 7, where he describes how dialectic leads the mind from the darkness of the cave up to the vision of the intelligible sun, and emphasizes how paltry our worldly doings are by comparison. Nevertheless, he ends up treating the ascent to the vision of the idea as instrumental to the cause of earthly justice. He reminds Glaucon that the polis educates the guardians up to the vision of the good in itself, quote, not in order to turn in whatever direction they want, but to make use of them, to bind the city together. And I want to emphasize the word use that he uses here, because that's going to become crucial later in book 10. To make use of the guardians, as one would make use of anything else having to do with the techne. However they might desire to spend their lives wrapped in intellectual vision, they owe a debt to the city for educating them, and they must pay this debt by coming back down, quote, to the common dwelling place, where they must, quote, grow accustomed to seeing in the dark. That's at 519. The life of the polis is notionally of little importance, yet it's the supreme value that drives Socrates' pursuit of philosophy, as it was apparently the main purpose of his own life. He who spent his entire life trying to make the citizens of Athens better, and who drank the hemlock rather than be exiled. And you see that I'm speaking of Socrates rather than Plato. For any Plato lover, the problem of Socrates is, of course, a deep one. And over the decades, I've come to really feel Socrates as a very distinct force in Plato's texts. You know the standard division between them. Socrates is the ethical thinker, Plato is the thinker of the ideas. And there's a lot more to that division than I suspected when I started reading Plato. So if the struggle for justice in the law courts were really just contention about shadows, there would be no compelling reason for the dialecticians to sacrifice their ecstatic vision for the aggravation of governing, or for Socrates to spend so much effort in designing the polis that would educate them to be governors. Now, in Republic 7, there's only one idea, the idea of the good. And Socrates describes this idea as the source of all that is correct and beautiful, orthos and kalos, and of all truth and understanding, and says that one can act wisely only by learning to see the idea. One can act wisely only by learning to see the idea. But how is the guidance of the idea supposed to translate into actual guidelines for correct action? This is, of course, always the problem with the ideas, is their abstraction. The only rational, reliable guide for action that Socrates knows is Technic. And he tries to bridge the gap between the idea and the Techni through the concept of number and calculation. He says that all the Techni, no matter how lowly, the carpenter and the cook, as well as the general and the statesman, must use number and calculate, because they must measure things in their true proportions, undeceived by the illusions of perspective. Dialectic is the highest of the Techni because it raises the arts of calculation to the highest level of abstraction, treating pure numbers detached from any, quote, visible or tangible qualities. By doing this, dialectic teaches the soul to look upward to the realm of the invisible, while remaining linked to the lower Techni by the reliance on number. There's thus a sort of Techne pyramid with the most material, least abstractly mathematical of the Techni at the bottom, and dialectic at the apex from which the ideas can be viewed in their purity. Once trained to this apex, the guardians, using the good itself as a model, will be able to bring good order to the city and its citizens. Thus, for Socrates, the ideas are not only real, but also effectual. They have the dunamis, power, to cause all that is correct and beautiful, orthos and kalos. But this power cannot be actualized without the mediation of human action. As long as the minds of human beings are fixated on the shadows of the cave, the idea itself has no power to turn them towards itself. And anyhow, only the tiniest fraction of human beings, the most gifted of the guardians, are ever going to be able to learn to look at the ideas. Socrates implicitly acknowledges that in order to permeate the polis all the way down to the mass of the citizenry, the order bestowing power of the ideas must be actualized by Techne in all its forms, wielded by skilled practitioners who have learned their skills not by looking at ideas, but by practice. The entire Republic tries to work out in as much detail as possible the organization of these worldly mediations, the Techni that would be able to actualize the power of the ideas. The Techne of the guardian dialecticians is thus primarily the craft of organizing in the most orthos and kalos way the entire hierarchy of Techni in the polis, this Techne pyramid that I described. Although Socrates claims that the principles of order can be learned from the mental vision of the idea of the good, he tries in the Republic as a whole to devise a bridge between the causative power of the ideas and the practicalities of Techne, always with an awareness of the specific steps artisans must take to achieve their ends, the knowledge of tools and materials that they must have, and the kinds of training specialists must undergo. I can't emphasize too strongly how deeply Socrates was permeated by this kind of thinking. And I take it, I like to think that he really was trained as a stonemason. His father certainly was, and that he had a kind of intuitive, immediate sense of what the crafts are like, a sense that Plato apparently did not have. That's why immediately after articulating, okay, and here I'm getting to like the key point of the lecture. Immediately after articulating his initial three-level ontology, the three couches, in which he begins to move toward a new three-level schema of a radically different kind, in which all three levels are worldly and reality is defined in terms of the pragmatic details of tool making and tool use by artisans. And this new three-level analogy that I'm about to discuss has baffled scholars of Plato. They don't know how to make sense of it in the context. He begins to turn to his new schema by suddenly switching from the example of a painted couch to that of a painted couch maker, a carpenter. That's an amazing turn that he makes. And it's such a much more fascinating image of a painted mimesis than that of a couch or a table. And yet, you know, it's attracted so much less attention than the three couches. A good painter, he says, can make a painting of a carpenter that at a distance, quote, would deceive children and foolish men and make them believe it to be a real carpenter. And he can do this even though the painter himself has no expertness in any of these techni. Since he doesn't claim that a carpenter, like a couch, is a copy of an idea of a carpenter, this switch unmoors the painting analogy from the three levels of reality ontology for which it had been originally introduced. Now Socrates' point is no longer that the painted image is an imitation of a copy of a full reality, but that the real carpenter has knowledge that is missing from the carpenter's image in the painting. The painting does not have the knowledge that the carpenter has. It's no longer, but that the real creator is, and that the painter of the image doesn't possess this knowledge either, and that the image might deceive someone into thinking that the painted image does possess it. This is the fundamental sleight of hand that Socrates finally focuses on in Mimesis. The possibility that someone can be deceived by mimesis into thinking that a represented person has techne knowledge that they do not have. It's not about material objects being mimed. The knowledge is the crucial thing, techne knowledge. This turn in Socrates' argument is hard to make sense of in terms of his preceding remarks, but its motivation becomes clear from what follows. He is about to focus at last on the real targets of his critique of mimesis, tragedy and its leader, Homer. The far-fetched criticism of the painter for lacking the knowledge of the artisan whose image he paints is a makeshift bridge to Socrates' central accusation, that because Homer's poems represent all the Techni, they have fooled many into thinking that Homer himself possessed the Techne knowledge appropriate to them all. The ultimate source of mimetic contamination is now at last identified as the citizenry's belief in the possession by Socrates. As this in possession by Homer, sorry, of a universal episteme, not just everything about the Techni, but also all human affairs concerned with excellence and badness, and all about the gods. In the discussion that follows, however, Socrates doesn't talk about the gods again, and when he discusses excellence and badness, it is in terms of Techne knowledge exclusively. He says at one point that the poets imitate images of arete, and practically in the next breath, he says that they make colored pictures of each of the Techni. So that by pictures of the Techni, he seems to mean the same thing that he means by pictures of arete or excellence. And the examples he gives of the greatest and most callous things of which Homer speaks, warfare, generalship, city government, and people's education, these are all things that Socrates consistently treats as Techni, both in the Republic and in other dialogues. Having at last focused on Homer, Socrates pours scorn on him and poets in general, whose works are, as he now says, I have 2 removes from truth here, I guess it would be 3 removes in the Greek. The notion that poetic mimeses are twice or 3 times removed from truth echoes the initial description of mimesis in the Allegory of the 3 Couches. But this reference has now become tangled because the poets are accused of making phantasms of forms of knowledge-based action, the Techni, not of things like couches. You follow what I'm saying here? Why is he still saying that mimesis is 3 times removed when we're not referring to the ideas anymore, but to the possession or lack of possession of Techne knowledge? I read Socrates in these passages as insensibly sliding from the notion that Homer is twice removed from the truth of the forms to the notion that he is once removed from the truth of correct Techne. The key transitional passage is at 599b, where he says that if Homer, quote, had had episteme of the things he imitates, he would be much more serious about erga, works or actions, than about imitations of them. Actions of the kind involved in warfare, generalship, city government, and education. These are the kinds of order-imposing actions that correspond to the higher Techni, the kinds in which the guardians are to be trained. To know such Techni is to possess the, quote, episteme about excellence that Socrates now says Homer manifestly lacked. But because if he had not been second from the truth about arete, excellence, if he had even been once removed and capable of knowing how to make people better, then he would have benefited people and would have moved them closer to excellence, which he didn't do. At first glance, the natural way of interpreting these remarks is in light of the original painting analogy. On this analogy, the excellent organization of all things is caused by the power of the idea, and good actions also must be caused by it. So here Socrates is implying, on the model of the couchmaker who is once removed from truth, that those who know how to make people better are also at this remove. But to reason this way, we have to ignore not only the obscurities in the initial schema itself, but the additional difficulty that there exists no divine patterns of specific actions for human artisans to copy, not even as problematic a kind of pattern as Socrates has proposed for carpenters and other demiurgoi who craft physical artifacts. That is the idea of a couch. That's the problematic pattern to which I'm referring. It's one thing to say that the idea of the good is the ultimate source of order and beauty, and another, quite different thing, to posit a specific pattern for the actions of a legislator, a general, or an educator. And Socrates now seems to feel the logical gap because he now introduces his radically revised three-level schema, one that evicts the idea completely from the schema and replaces it with what he names as the highest level of techne, the level of use. In place of the idea, we now have use, the use by a trained, skilled demiurgos. This is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, how have we've gone from heaven to earth in the biggest way, and without any comment. Socrates makes no comment on how he got from one thing to the other. For each thing, Socrates now says, there are three techni. One that uses it, one that makes it, and one that imitates it. And only the user possesses episteme about the excellence of the artifact, because only the user knows whether the artifact functions well in actual use and can instruct the maker as to what is kreston, optimally functional about the artifact, and what is not. Strikingly, whereas in book 7, he says that the correctness and beauty of all things derive from the idea, now in direct contradiction, he states categorically that, quote, the arete, the kalos, and the orthotes of each implement, living creature, and action are related to nothing but the use, kreion, for which each is made or naturally adapted. The bit and bridle maker or the flute maker has only right opinion about their products, since they don't know firsthand how well the artifacts function in use. But the user has episteme about it, because this knowledge has been empirically derived from experience working with the implement. Socrates makes no attempt whatever to reconcile what he's saying now with the doctrine of ideas. So when he repeats again that imitation is twice removed from the truth, or 3 times removed, the natural way to take this is in light of the doctrine of use that he has just stated. He has now replaced his original 3-level schema with a new 3-level schema. And when he says that it's 2 or 3 times removed, that imitation is, what is he referring to? One might want to think that it's the ideas, but since he's just given us this new 3-level schema, it seems to me the natural way to take it is that he's referring to what he just said. On this understanding, the truth from which the poet is twice removed is not that of the idea, but that of use, the truth that is known by the user artisan. If we take him at his word, Socrates here, at least momentarily, abandons the notion that order and excellence derive from the idea in favor of a strictly empirical, pragmatic genesis. The unexplained introduction of this new 3-level schema has baffled interpreters of Plato, as I mentioned, but it makes sense in the context of the entire Republic, which is to devise a plan for optimal organization of the polis, so that the souls of the citizens might be unified and harmonized in themselves and in relation to the polity as a whole. The new 3-level schema, with its 3 levels of techne, user, maker, and imitator, bends the discussion of imitation back towards this question, this central concern with the organization of the polis. which Socrates has from book one on, conceived in terms of Techne, thoroughly in terms of Techne. This entire book I read as a treatise on Techne. When he starts imagining his optimal city, what does he imagine? He imagines who are the demiurgoi, the basic demiurgoi that you have to have in the city. And then he starts adding demiurgoi, Techni, to the city. The building blocks of the city are Techni. And the Techni have from the beginning been given the crucial role of properly shaping the souls of the citizens, as Mikkel explained, including the guardians. As I mentioned earlier, the guardians are raised to the level of the idea for the purpose of making them adequate managers of the harmonization of the city. Only the most elite of the guardians will ever derive their episteme of order, from the ideas themselves. Everyone else will have to acquire it from a well-ordered civic and political environment and from a good education that includes training in a single techne, to which they are then to devote themselves for life. The keystone of this entire conceptual edifice is that the soul of the artisan who is able to make kalos work, the soul of the artisan who is able to make kalos work, is itself well-ordered, made kalos by the strict discipline of learning the technique. A well-ordered soul is one that has a well-defined boundary of identity, one that is not susceptible to the allure of mimetic identifications, as Mikkel explained. And I went on and talked some more about that, but there's no need now that we've heard Mikkel read his bit. You know about the techni, about the fact that each artisan must practice only one techne, and that shapes the soul, the tupos of the soul. So that's my spiel for today. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Henry, for this very detailed, close reading of a moment in book 10 that tends to puzzle readers and that you tie to the general economy of the Republic and Socrates' interest in craft and techne. I really appreciate your attention to bringing Plato down to earth via Socrates in an immanent Nietzschean empirical way that I think is in line with your recent work on Techne, specifically the book I mentioned, Technic Theory.